The Siege of Fort Erie was one of the last and most protracted engagements between British and American forces during the Niagara campaign of the American War of 1812. From the 4th of August to the 21st of September, the Americans successfully defended Fort Erie against a British army. During the siege, the British suffered heavy casualties in a failed storming attempt and also suffered from sickness and exposure in their rough encampments. Unaware that the British were about to abandon the siege, the American garrison later launched a sortie to destroy the British siege batteries, during which both sides again suffered heavy losses. After the British abandoned the siege, the reinforced American army followed up cautiously, but with the onset of winter and shortage of supplies they withdrew, and abandoned and demolished the fort. Background: the Americans under Major General Jacob Brown had crossed the Niagara River and captured Fort Erie on 3 July 1814. After defeating a British force at the Battle of Chippewa, they advanced north, but the British reinforced their troops in the Niagara Peninsula. On 25 July, the bloody but indecisive Battle of Lundy's Lane was fought, during which Brown was severely wounded. Following the battle, the outnumbered American troops, now under the command of Brigadier General Eleazar Wheelock Ripley, withdrew to Fort Erie. Ripley advocated abandoning the fort and retreating across the Niagara, but Brown overruled him and summoned Brigadier General Edmund P. Gaines from Sackett's Harbor to assume command. The British, under the command of Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, had themselves been hard hit at Lundy's Lane. Drummond nevertheless claimed that the Americans had been forced to retreat in disorder and he intended to drive them from the Canadian side of the Niagara. His troops followed the Americans slowly and reached the fort on 4 August. Drummond's division numbered 3,000, but Drummond himself complained about the quality of the troops and the degree to which the units were composed of mixed-up detachments and companies. His slow advance gave the Americans vitally needed time to reorganize and to reinforce their defenses. The original British fort consisted of two two-story barrack buildings with fortified cannon bastions connected to them. The barracks were connected by a thick stone curtain with the main gate located in the center. The rear of the fort consisted of an open turret line, raised 6 feet above the base of the dry ditch which surrounded the fort, with 2 redoubts located on the corner. The redoubts were incomplete and offered little protection. The front of the fort was protected by a large earth wall with a forward gun emplacement. The fort was also divided in half by an earth wall and ditch, but this too was incomplete, with at least a third of the rear defenses being makeshift wooden walls or earthworks, some of which were only 1 meter high. This was complemented by a gun emplacement in the center redden. The fort contained a total of 6 guns. The dry ditch surrounding the fort had a 9 feet high wooden wall in the center. This wall was angled outwards and was sharpened to prevent any enemy from leaping into the ditch, which also had sharpened sticks placed up and down the walls to help impale or wound enemy soldiers. The ditch was used as a garbage dump and a sewer by the defenders, creating a slippery and smelly swamp at the base that would slow enemy attacks and would encourage disease in any wounds. Since the fort was too small to hold the entire American force, they extended the earth wall to the south for an additional 800 meters to a rise made of sand, known as Snake Hill, where they constructed a gun battery to protect the north end of the position. The Americans also threw up an earth wall connecting the northeast bastion of the fort to the lake, where there was another fortified gun emplacement, known as the Douglas Battery, from its commander, Lieutenant David Douglas of the U.S. Corps of Engineers. Abattis were placed in front of the earth walls. By the close of the siege, the Americans had made the position even stronger by building 3 log blockhouses in the rear of the fort and had also strengthened the defenses and redoubts. Preliminaries. Raid on Black Rock and Buffalo. When the British force reached Fort Erie, Drummond's first move on 3 August was to send a force across the Niagara in bateau to raid Buffalo and Black Rock, hoping to capture or destroy American supplies and provisions. The force consisted of 2 columns. One was composed of the 2 flank companies and 4 of the center companies of the 41st Foot under Lieutenant Colonel Evans of the 41st, and other of the light companies of the 2nd Battalion, the 89th Foot and the 100th Foot, and the flank companies of the 104th Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel William Drummond of Kelty, General Drummond's nephew. With some artillerymen, the force numbered 600 men in total. The force was under the overall command of Lieutenant Colonel John Tucker, the senior Lieutenant Colonel of the 41st Foot. The raid was a failure. On landing on the American side of the Niagara, Tucker found that the bridge over the unfordable Conjocta Creek had been destroyed, and a detachment of 240 men of the 1st U.S. Rifle Regiment under Major Lodowick Morgan with some volunteers were defending the creek to prevent the bridge being repaired. The British casualty return gave 11 killed, 17 wounded and 5 missing. The Americans took 6 prisoners, indicating that one of the British soldiers who had been returned as killed had in fact been captured. This made the British loss 10 killed, 17 wounded and 6 captured. Tucker complained that the troops panicked and fled, though they subsequently rallied. The Americans lost 2 killed and 8 wounded. Morgan was killed a few days later in a clash between outposts. Preparations for the siege. Drummond lost several vital subordinates during the next few days, forcing him to take personal charge of the siege. Major General Phineas Ryle, the commander of the Right Division, on the Niagara Peninsula, had been wounded and captured at Lundy's Lane. His replacement, Major General Henry Conran, who had recently arrived from England, broke a leg in a fall from a horse and was incapacitated. Colonel Stewart of the Royal Scots was summoned from York to replace him but fell ill with ague, and Colonel Hercules Scott of the 103rd Foot requested permission to relinquish his command of a brigade and revert to command of his regiment. Capture of Ohio and Somers. While the British constructed their siege lines and batteries, 3 American schooners anchored in the Niagara River harassed him with gunfire. At the time, 3 small craft from the British Naval Squadron on Lake Ontario were blockaded in the mouth of the Niagara River by 3 larger American vessels. Commander Alexander Dobbs, in command of the British vessels, and his sailors and Royal Marines dragged a gig and 5 other boats overland from below Niagara Falls and launched a boarding attack on the American schooners off Fort Erie on the night of the 12th of August. The crews of the schooners spotted and challenged them, but the British replied, "Provision boats," and deceived the Americans long enough to bring their boats alongside. They captured the Ohio and Somers. The crew of the Porcupine escaped this fate by cutting their anchor cables before slipping away, but were accidentally fired upon by U.S. artillery on the shore. The British lost 2 killed and 4 wounded in the engagement, while the Americans had 1 killed and 70 captured, of whom 8 were wounded. This victory raised British morale, but Drummond mistakenly believed that it depressed American morale to the same extent. He was encouraged in this belief by some American deserters, who also reported the defenders as numbering only 1,500, when in fact there were 2,200. British assault. On the 13th of August, Drummond opened fire on the fort with 2 light 24-pounder field guns and 4 18-pounder or 24-pounder naval guns. The bombardment was fired from too long a range and was ineffective against the fort's walls. Drummond nevertheless launched a 3-pronged attack on the night of 15-16 August, with each arm of the attack aimed at one of the American batteries. The largest column, of 1,300 soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor Fisher, would outflank the south end of the defenses at Snake Hill. Another column of 700 soldiers under Colonel Hercules Scott would attack the Douglas Battery in the north end of the defenses and sweep into the U.S. camp, meeting Fisher's column in the middle. Finally, a column of 360 soldiers, Sailors and Marines led by Lieutenant Colonel William Drummond would attack the fort once the other assaults were underway, with the objective of capturing the old British barrack buildings. A reserve of just under 700 men was left in the siege lines under Lieutenant Colonel Tucker. Colonel Scott and Lieutenant Colonel Drummond were both experienced soldiers and had little confidence in General Drummond's plan. Both men arranged their affairs before heading into battle, sending their papers home to their wives. Drummond even gave away his sword to Surgeon William "Tiger" Dunlop of the 89th. Shortly before moving out, both men wished each other luck and bade farewell. The columns moved out after dark, but the preparations during the day had been obvious from the fort. Surprise would be nearly impossible to achieve. While Fish's column made its long march to the south of Snake Hill, Scott's and Drummond's columns waited in the pouring rain in a ravine a few hundred yards north of the fort. An hour before the assault began, the British bombardment of the fort ceased, having inflicted casualties on the garrison of 10 killed and 35 wounded. American preparations in the fort. General Gaines ordered his men to stand to. This produced rumblings from the troops forced to stand in their positions in heavy rain, but would prove invaluable in the coming battle. He also ordered that the charges in all guns were to be drawn and replaced, ensuring the guns would not misfire through damp powder. Brigadier General Ripley defended Snake Hill with the 21st and 23rd U.S. Infantry. The hill was topped with a large gun emplacement containing 6 guns under the command of Captain Nathaniel Towson. The fort itself was defended by 2 companies of the 19th U.S. Infantry, and 3 guns under Captains Williams and Gookin. The wall between the fort and the Douglas Battery was manned by the 9th U.S. Infantry, a company of volunteers from the New York and Pennsylvania militia, the dismounted New York Volunteer Dragoons, and another gun. The long wall between the fort and the Snake Hill, which was not attacked, was defended by Brigadier General Peter B. Porter with detachments of the 1st and 4th U.S. Rifle Regiments, the 5th Pennsylvania Volunteers, Swift's Regiment of Detached New York Militia, and 5 guns. Finally, 2 companies of the 11th and 22nd U.S. Infantry and a detachment of the U.S. Light Dragoons were in reserve. Fish's attack. Fish's column consisted of the light companies of the 289th Foot and the 100th Foot, the remnants of the 1st Battalion, 8th Foot, which had suffered heavy casualties in earlier engagements, and volunteers from Fish's own regiment, the Regiment de Watteville. De Watteville's nominally Swiss regiment was made up of men from all over Europe, many of them former prisoners of war or deserters from the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the British commanders suspected their loyalty. On the approach march, the roll was called every hour to prevent desertion. Except for a few steady men, the entire column was ordered to remove their firearms or flints and take the enemy battery on the hill with the bayonet. The column encountered an American picket 300 meters from the defenses. Surprise was nearly achieved, but because of the rainy weather, the British troops' advance was betrayed by the loud swishing sound made as they passed through high grass. The picket opened fire, alerting the garrison, before hastily retreating. The leading attackers rushed forward to the abatis. As they reached it, Towson opened fire. The rate of fire from his battery would earn it the nickname, Towson's Lighthouse. After several attempts to storm the battery, many attackers broke and fled in panic, sweeping away the steady soldiers to their rear. Those who did try to scale the defenses found that many of the siege ladders built for the attack had been made without taking the ditches into account and were as much as 5 feet too short to get over the wall. The light company of de Watteville's regiment attempted to bypass the defenses by swimming in the Niagara River. The current proved to be too swift, and many of the men were swept away to their death. Those who survived were quickly captured. Some of the attackers charged the battery 5 times before retiring. Some units, such as the light company of the 8th, lost 2/3 of their strength. De Watteville's regiment had 144 casualties. Ripley, commanding this section of the American defenses, reported taking 147 prisoners. His men suffered only a dozen casualties. Fish's column reeled back in confusion, and it was decided another attempt was impossible. Scott's attack. Colonel Hercules Scott's column consisted of his own 103rd Regiment, less its light company. He launched his attack as soon as firing was heard from Snake Hill. Surprise was quickly lost when American pickets detected them and fired muskets to alert the defenders. Once the British had moved close enough, the guns of the fort and the Douglas Battery and several hundred U.S. infantry opened fire, causing horrific losses to the British, who were jammed into a narrow front between an embankment and the lake. Colonel Scott was mortally wounded by a musket ball in the head early in the attack. His second-in-command, Major William Smelt, was also seriously wounded. At one point in the battle, a cry rose from the British forces of "Stop firing, you're shooting your own men," and the fighting ceased for almost an entire minute until an American officer, unconvinced by the unfamiliarly accented appeal, shouted back, "To hell with you," and the firing resumed. Scott's shattered regiment fell back with 360 casualties. The Americans facing them reported no casualties from Scott's attack. William Drummond's attack. Lieutenant Colonel William Drummond's column consisted of a small detachment of gunners of the Royal Artillery, the flank companies of the 41st Foot and of the 104th Foot, 50 Royal Marines and 90 seamen of the Royal Navy under Commander Dobbs. The attack on the fort initially made little headway, using the cover of darkness and the heavy smoke that hung over the field. Drummond then moved his men through the defensive ditch to assault the northeast bastion. The British caught the U.S. artillerymen there completely by surprise, and they quickly abandoned their guns and fled. Those under Captain John Williams and Lieutenant Patrick McDonough who stood and fought were quickly killed as Drummond cried out, "Give no quarter to the damn Yankees." A group of soldiers from the 21st U.S. Infantry reorganized themselves in the parade square and poured fire into the bastion. It is believed that Drummond was killed in this barrage. According to one American soldier, in the thick of the fighting he saw a red-coated demon, armed with a pike and screaming for his own death, which we quickly obliged him to. He fell not far from our feet, no less than a musket's length away. The attackers twice charged through a gap 7 feet wide between the two barrack buildings into the parade ground, but were unable to break into the barrack buildings and mess hall. The defenders in turn tried to recapture the northeast bastion but were driven back. General Drummond sent only 2 companies of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Scots to reinforce the attackers. They lost half their men and very few of them even reached the fort. After fighting swayed back and forth for nearly an hour, some Americans turned around an 18-pounder cannon on the rear end and began to fire into the bastion less than 50 yards away. The British responded by turning one of the captured cannons around and knocking the American 18-pounder off its carriage. Shortly after the British began firing their captured guns, a large powder magazine in the bastion beneath their feet ignited. The explosion was immense, destroying the entire bastion and most of the attached barracks building. A 2-ton cannon was thrown 100 yards out of the fort. Between 150 and 250 men, mainly British and Canadians, were killed in the bastion. It was gruesomely reported that some attackers were blown from the walls of the fort to land on the bayonets of those still in the ditch. The explosion caused havoc for both sides. Although the Americans in the fort were sheltered from the full force of the explosion by the barrack buildings, Lieutenant Douglas was nearly killed when a large piece of flaming timber crushed the man next to him. The surviving attackers were convinced that the entire fort was mined and they retreated in panic. Drummond's column had been almost wiped out during the attack. When the 104th assembled the next day and roll was called, those who were still standing openly wept at the loss of over half of their men who had attacked. Aftermath. In total, the British suffered 57 killed, 309 wounded and 537 missing. The Journal of Surgeon William Dunlop described working on the wounded for nearly 3 days without ceasing. The Americans reported capturing 360 prisoners, 174 of whom were wounded. General Gaines reported that 222 dead British troops were left in and around the fort. This would give a revised British loss of 222 killed, 309 wounded, 360 captured and 12 missing. The garrison suffered 17 killed, 56 wounded and 11 missing.